Leonardo da Vinci, a sleep story. There is a place in the hills of Tuscany where the light falls differently than anywhere else in the world, where the morning mist rises slowly from the valleys like a breath held gently and then released, where the olive trees stand silver-gray along the slopes and the vineyards curl in long, unhurried rows down toward the river. And it is in this place, in this soft and ancient landscape, that our story begins, on an April morning in the year 1452, when the world was still very young in its knowing, and a child came into it quietly, surrounded by the smell of warm stone and pine and the distant sound of bells drifting up from the village below. The village was called Vinci, a small and gentle place tucked into the folds of the Apennine foothills, not far from Florence but far enough that the air was clean and slow, that the seasons moved with a kind of deliberate grace that you could feel in your bones, that the mornings arrived soft and unhurried and the evenings settled with a long, amber patience over the hills. The farms around Vinci were quiet places, full of the sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves and the slow movement of water through stone channels, and it was in a farmhouse not far from this village, on a hillside where the spring wildflowers were just beginning to open, that the child who would become Leonardo was first placed into the world. His mother was a young woman named Caterina, a peasant girl with steady hands and quiet eyes, and his father was Sir Piero da Vinci, a notary from a family of some standing, a man of ink and documents and formal speech, who would later move to Florence and build a life of comfortable industry there. But in those first years, in those earliest and softest years, Leonardo lived in the farmhouse of his grandfather Antonio, a gentle old man who tended his garden with a calm and loving patience, who walked the hillside paths in the early morning with unhurried steps, who knew the name of every plant and every bird and every kind of cloud that passed over the valley, and who, in the long quiet afternoons of those early years, would sometimes sit with a small child beside him and simply look out at the world together, not speaking, just watching, just being still in the way that old men and very young children sometimes can be still, as though both are in on a secret that the busy middle years of life tend to obscure. The farmhouse sat on a gentle slope, and from its stone terrace you could see for a very long way, across the valley of the Arno, across the pale green hills rolling one behind the other like waves on a very slow sea, toward the blue distance where the mountains gathered at the horizon and held the sky in place. In the early morning, when the mist was still lying in the valleys, only the hilltops showed above it, like islands in a white and quiet lake, and if you stood on that terrace in the first light of dawn, with the dew still on the grass and the birds just beginning their first tentative songs in the olive trees, you might have felt, as the child Leonardo must have felt, that the world was made of light and distance and possibility, that everything was softly waiting to be understood. Those early years on the hillside were years of watching and wondering, years of the particular kind of attention that children give to the world when no one has yet told them what is important and what is not, when every beetle on a stone and every shadow moving across the grass and every cloud building slowly above the hills is equally worthy of long and unhurried study. There is a way that very young children inhabit the world that most adults have lost entirely. A way of being completely present in a single moment, of letting a single thing fill all of awareness, of not being in any hurry to move on to the next thing because the present thing is so fully interesting, and this quality, which most people outgrow as the demands of life and learning begin to fill the mind with other things, Leonardo seems never to have outgrown, seems to have carried forward from these early years on the hillside of Vinci into every subsequent decade of his life, a gift that disguised itself as mere curiosity but was really something deeper, a constitutional inability to regard anything in the world as unworthy of attention. Leonardo would walk the paths around the farm for hours at a time, coming home with his pockets full of interesting stones and the shed skins of lizards and feathers that had fallen from passing birds and small flowers whose names he did not yet know but whose shapes he held in his memory with great precision and care. He would sit by the small stream that ran through the lower field and watch the water for what seemed like a very long time, watching the way it moved around the stones, the way it darkened and lightened as the depth changed, the way a leaf placed on its surface would spin and drift and find the current and then move smoothly away. And this watching was not idleness but a kind of deep and patient learning, the kind of learning that happens before words, before categories, before the mind begins to sort the world into what matters and what does not. The seasons on the hillside were distinct and generous. Spring came with a rush of green and the smell of rain on warm earth and the sudden appearance of poppies along the field edges, red and soft and almost unreal in their brightness. Summer was long and hot and still, and in the afternoons when the heat pressed down on the land the whole valley would go quiet, the birds resting in the shade of the trees, the cicadas keeping up their patient, steady hum that seemed to fill the air completely and then, when you stopped noticing it, to become the silence itself. Autumn brought the grape harvest and the olive harvest and the smell of wood smoke in the evenings and the light that changed from the white heat of summer to something gold and slanted and very beautiful, a light that lay on everything with a kind of tenderness that made the hillside look like a painting of itself, and perhaps this is where Leonardo first understood, without having the words for it, that light was not just the thing that made the world visible but was itself a living presence. A shaping force, the thing that gave the world its texture and its depth and its emotional weight. Winter on the hillside was quiet. The vines were stripped and the fields were brown and the mist was more persistent, sometimes staying all day in the valley so that the farm seemed to float in a gentle grey softness, and the evenings came early and the fire in the farmhouse was the centre of everything, the warm orange light of it moving on the stone walls and the smell of burning wood and the sound of the fire itself, a soft and steady crackle that was as much a part of winter as the cold air outside. In these winter evenings, Leonardo would sit by the fire and listen to his grandfather and uncle and the other adults talking in the slow and unhurried way of people who have nowhere else to be, and even if he did not understand all of what they said, he was learning something about the rhythm of human life, the way stories and observations and small jokes and the retelling of familiar events create the texture of an ordinary day, the way the world is held together not by grand events but by the accumulation of small and ordinary moments, each one gentle and forgettable and, in their totality, entirely sufficient. It was around the age of 5 or 6 that Leonardo began to draw. Not with any formal instruction, not with pencils or pens or the tools that a proper student of drawing would use, but with whatever was at hand, a stick in the dust of the path, a piece of charcoal on a flat stone, a finger drawn through the condensation on a window. He drew the things he saw around him, the shapes of leaves and the curve of a hill and the posture of a cat sitting in the sun, and what was remarkable about these early drawings, even to the adults who saw them, was their accuracy, the way the line seemed to follow not just the outline of the thing but something of its inner nature, as if the child had looked at the cat or the leaf not just with his eyes but with some deeper faculty of attention that caught the essential quality of the thing and rendered it visible in the line. His uncle Francesco, who worked the farm and was a warm and patient man, noticed this gift and encouraged it, bringing home pieces of good paper when he went to the market in town, letting the boy draw on the smooth plastered walls of the outbuildings with a piece of soft stone. And so drawing became a constant part of Leonardo's days on the hillside, as natural and necessary as walking or eating, a way of engaging with the world that was both observation and creation at once, a way of looking so deeply at a thing that you understood it from the inside, that the line your hand made on the paper was not a copy of the thing but a kind of knowing of it. When Leonardo was around 5 years old, his father Ser Piero took him to live in Florence for a time, and then he came back to the farm, and then there were several years of this moving between the ordered, formal world of the Florentine household and the quiet, open world of the farm, and both worlds were shaping him, both worlds were filling him with the particular kind of knowledge that only a particular kind of place can give. Florence was a city of stone and beauty and commerce and art, a city where the great buildings of the past and the great buildings of the present stood side by side in a kind of conversation, where the streets were full of the sounds and smells of craft and trade and the urgent human energy of a place that was, in the middle of the 15th century, becoming one of the most important cities in the world. And yet Leonardo, even in Florence, was always looking for the natural world, always noticing the sky above the rooftops and the way the light fell through a narrow street and the pigeons on the cornices of the churches, always finding in the city the traces of the same forces that moved so visibly in the open landscape of the hillside. When he was around 14 or 15 years old, his father Ser Piero, who had by now established himself as a successful notary in Florence and who had connections throughout the artistic community of the city, brought a selection of Leonardo's drawings to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, who was at that time one of the most respected artists and craftsmen in Florence, a man whose workshop produced paintings and sculptures and goldwork and mechanical devices, a man who understood that art and craft and the study of the natural world were not separate things but expressions of a single deep curiosity about how things were made and how they worked. Verrocchio looked at the drawings and recognized in them the quality that his father had already intuited, a quality of attention and skill that was beyond what a young man of 15 should ordinarily possess, and he agreed to take Leonardo as an apprentice. And so the move was made. The boy from the hillside above Vinci came to the city of Florence in a different way now, not as a visitor to his father's house but as a worker, a learner, a member of the community of craftsmen who made the beauty of the city. The workshop of Verrocchio was in the parish of Sant'Ambrogio, not far from the Arno, and it was a place of constant and varied activity, a place where marble and bronze and wood and gold and paint and plaster were all in use at the same time, where the smells of turpentine and metal dust and fresh pigment mixed in the air with the sounds of hammering and grinding and the low voices of men working with close attention on delicate tasks. Leonardo arrived in this workshop as a young man with clear eyes and quick hands and an already remarkable gift for drawing, and he found in it exactly the kind of environment his particular nature required, a place where skill was valued above status, where the question of how something worked was always more interesting than the question of what it was called, where the natural world was not something separate from art but the very source and foundation of it. The days in the workshop began early. In Florence in the second half of the 15th century, the working day followed the light, and the light in spring and summer came very early, and the first hours of the morning were considered the best hours for delicate work, for painting, and for drawing, when the air was cool and the eye was fresh and the light that came through the high north-facing windows of the workshop was even and clear and revealed the true colors of things without the distortion that the stronger afternoon light could bring. Leonardo would rise in the gray before dawn and go to the workshop and, while the city was still quiet outside, would sit at his workbench and draw, sometimes from observation, sometimes from memory, sometimes working out the geometry of a problem he had been thinking about in the night, filling the pages of his notebooks with the fine and rapid lines that were already, even in these early years, entirely his own. A kind of handwriting as distinctive and personal as the handwriting of his words, which he wrote, as everyone who knew him noted, from right to left, in mirror script, a habit whose origins are not entirely clear but which suggests a mind that was comfortable moving against the usual direction, that found its own path through the conventions of the world. The smell of the workshop in those early morning hours was a particular and memorable thing, a combination of linseed oil and turpentine and the chalk dust that lay on every surface and the faint metallic smell of the bronze work and the animal glue that was used to prepare the wooden panels for painting, and beneath all of this the clean cold smell of the stone floor and the stone walls, the smell of Florence itself, a smell of age and use and the quiet persistence of craft. Leonardo would have known this smell as intimately as he knew his own hands, would have associated it with the pleasure and the challenge of the work, with the particular quality of focused attention that the workshop demanded and that he was so naturally suited to provide. The candles on the workbench threw a warm and concentrated light on the surface where he was drawing, and outside the high windows the sky would be lightening very gradually, moving from the deep blue-black of the middle of the night through a series of almost imperceptible gradations toward the gray of pre-dawn and then the faint gold of the first actual light, and Leonardo, who thought about light as carefully and as continuously as he thought about anything, would have noticed this progression with pleasure, would have watched from the corner of his awareness the slow transformation of the sky as he worked, one more instance of the world's endless willingness to offer itself to the attentive eye. Verrocchio's workshop was engaged, during the years of Leonardo's apprenticeship, in some of the most important artistic projects in Florence. There was the great bronze bull that was placed on top of the dome of the cathedral, and there were sculptures in marble and terracotta, and there were paintings, and there was the constant stream of smaller commissions, silverwork and jewelry and decorated furniture, that kept the workshop busy and financially stable. Leonardo worked on all of these things, learning the properties of every material, learning to work in bronze as well as in paint, learning the craft of metalworking alongside the craft of painting, and this breadth of learning was not incidental to his development but essential to it, because what Leonardo was always seeking, in every medium and every material, was the underlying principle, the governing logic that explained why the bronze behaved as it did in the casting, why the pigment held or flaked, why the marble fractured in one direction and not another, why the surface of a polished metal reflected light in a way that was different from the surface of water or the surface of skin. In the evenings, after the workshop had been put in order and the tools cleaned and the materials covered, Leonardo would sometimes walk through the city, along the streets that ran between the great palaces and the small churches and the workshops of other craftsmen, watching the life of the city with the same quality of attention he had once given to the life of the hillside, noticing the way the people moved and the way the evening light touched the stone facades and the way the river looked from the bridges, a slow dark movement in the fading light, carrying the reflections of the city on its surface in long, wavering lines of gold and orange and deepening blue. Florence in the late afternoon was a very beautiful thing, a city that seemed to know its own beauty and to wear it with a certain ease, and Leonardo walked through it with the pleasure of a man who has found the place where his nature and his circumstances are in agreement, who has landed in the right soil and feels himself beginning to take root. It was during his years in Verrocchio's workshop that Leonardo began the practice that would define his intellectual life for the rest of his days, the practice of keeping detailed notebooks in which he recorded everything that interested him, everything he observed and thought and wondered about, everything he wanted to understand and everything he had already come to understand. the whole vast accumulation of his curiosity laid out in words and drawings and diagrams on page after page of the small notebooks that he carried with him always, that he filled and set aside and began again, hundreds of them over the course of a lifetime, a record of a mind that was perhaps the most comprehensively curious mind the world has ever produced. The notebooks began modestly enough, as tools of the workshop, places to sketch compositions and record measurements and make notes about the properties of materials and the mixing of pigments. But they quickly became something larger, something more personal and more wide-ranging, a space where Leonardo could think on paper, where he could follow a question from its origin in a particular observation through all the branching paths of implication and comparison and analogy, where a note about the way water flows around a stone could lead to a reflection on the movement of air, and from there to a sketch of a bird's wing, and from there to a diagram of a flying machine, and from there to a calculation about the weight of the human body, and from there back to a drawing of a river seen from above. The notebooks were a mind in motion, a record of the most productive kind of intellectual restlessness, and they would eventually contain, in addition to tens of thousands of drawings and diagrams, notes on painting and sculpture and architecture and anatomy and geology and botany and optics and hydraulics and music and mathematics and the nature of the soul, a body of observation and reflection so broad and so deep that even now, more than 500 years later, scholars are still working through the implications of what Leonardo wrote and drew in those small pages. In the year 1472, when Leonardo was 20 years old, he was admitted to the Guild of St. Luke, the Guild of Painters and Doctors in Florence, which meant that he was now officially recognized as a master in his craft, capable of taking on his own commissions and running his own workshop. This was a significant moment, a formal recognition of what those around him had already understood, that the young man from Vinci had become something remarkable, an artist of extraordinary skill and originality whose work already showed qualities that were new in Florentine painting, a depth of light, a softness of shadow, a sense of the living quality of the subjects that went beyond what his contemporaries, skilled as many of them were, had achieved. And yet Leonardo remained in Verrocchio's workshop for several more years, not out of obligation but out of genuine attachment, out of the sense that there was still more to learn, still more to understand about the materials and the methods and the underlying principles. He was not in any hurry. He was never in any hurry. This was one of the qualities that those who knew him noted most often, a kind of deep patience with the process of learning and creating, a willingness to spend whatever time a problem required, to go back and back again to the same question from different angles, to regard the incomplete and the unresolved not as a failure but as an invitation to keep looking, keep thinking, keep learning. During these years in Florence, Leonardo also became deeply engaged with the study of the human body, a study that would occupy him for decades and produce some of the most extraordinary anatomical drawings the world has ever seen. He began, as most painters of the time began, by studying the body in order to paint it, in order to understand how the muscles lay beneath the skin and how the joints moved and what the proportions were that made a human figure feel right to the eye. But very quickly the study went beyond what painting required, into a territory of pure curiosity, pure desire to understand, into the dissection of bodies obtained from hospitals and, later, from the morgues and charnel houses of the cities where he worked, into the careful and systematic examination of every organ and every bone and every vessel, into the creation of drawings that showed the body as it had never been shown before, from multiple angles simultaneously, as if the paper could contain all the views of a thing at once, as if understanding required not just seeing but seeing all the way around. The city of Florence in these years was a very particular kind of place, a city under the remarkable and in many ways enlightened rule of the Medici family, and especially under Lorenzo de' Medici, who was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity and aesthetic refinement who gathered around him the most interesting minds and the most accomplished artists of the time, and who created in Florence an environment in which learning and art were valued and supported, and could flourish in ways that were rare in that age or perhaps any age. Leonardo moved in the orbit of this world, attended the discussions and gatherings at the Medici Gardens and the Platonic Academy, encountered the ideas and arguments and enthusiasms that were circulating in the most educated circles of the city, and absorbed from this environment a sense of the breadth of human knowledge and the possibility of human understanding that would sustain him for the rest of his life. He was not a scholar in the conventional sense. He had not received the formal education of a university man, had not read all of Aristotle or mastered the disputations of the scholastic philosophers. He was always more comfortable with experience than with authority, more interested in what he could observe and test than in what he had been told. But this was not ignorance but a different kind of knowing, a knowing from the ground up rather than from the top down, a knowing that was always in contact with the actual texture and resistance of the real world, that could never stray very far from the specific and the concrete, that was always asking not what should be true but what is true, what does the water actually do, what does the wing actually look like, what does the light actually reveal. When Leonardo was around 30 years old, around the year 1482, he left Florence and went to Milan. The reasons for this move were partly practical and partly temperamental. He had been offered employment by Ludovico Sforza, who was the effective ruler of Milan, a man of ambition and resources who was building a court of considerable splendor and who wanted the best artists and the most capable minds working for him. Leonardo wrote Ludovico a letter offering his services, and the letter is remarkable for what it says about how Leonardo understood his own gifts, for it spends most of its length not on painting or sculpture, which were the things that had made his reputation, but on military engineering and hydraulics and architecture and the design of machines, the practical arts of building and defense and the management of water, before mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that he was also quite capable as a painter. This was not false modesty or strategic positioning but a genuine expression of how Leonardo understood himself, as an engineer and inventor and investigator of natural forces first, and as an artist second, or rather as someone for whom these were not separate categories at all but aspects of a single unified way of engaging with the world. The journey from Florence to Milan would have taken several days on horseback, moving north through the Apennines and then across the wide plain of the Po Valley, a landscape entirely unlike the hills of Tuscany, flat and immensely open, cut through with rivers and canals and irrigation channels, a landscape that spoke of human industry applied to natural abundance, of centuries of patient work transforming the rich alluvial soil into one of the most productive agricultural regions in Europe. Leonardo would have ridden through this landscape with his usual quality of close attention, noticing the water in the channels and the way the flat land held the sky differently from the hills, the way the distance was not broken by any elevation but simply extended, pale and luminous, to the horizon. And he would have made notes in his notebook and perhaps stopped to sketch the shape of a particular tree against the sky or the way the canal bank was cut and the way the water moved in the deeper channel of the river. Milan was a very different city from Florence. Where Florence was built on hills and surrounded by its particular landscape of olive groves and vineyards and cypress trees, Milan sat in the middle of the Great Plain, a flat, dense, fog-prone city organized around the massive Sforza castle and the great half-finished cathedral whose white marble spires were rising slowly toward completion in the center of the city. Milan was a city of commerce and military power more than a city of art, but it was also, under Ludovico, becoming a city of culture, and the court of the Sforzas was an environment of considerable sophistication, full of musicians and scholars and engineers and craftsmen, a place where the arts were pursued with the same seriousness and the same resources that were devoted to politics and warfare. Leonardo settled into the life of Milan with the adaptability that was one of his characteristic qualities, making himself useful in a great variety of ways, designing pageants and theatrical spectacles for the court, working on the equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza that Ludovico wanted cast in bronze and that would have been the largest bronze horse in the world if it had ever been completed, painting, making music. For Leonardo was also a musician of considerable skill and was said to have an extraordinarily beautiful singing voice, and pursuing his scientific investigations in the hours that were his own. He rented rooms not far from the castle and set up a workshop and took on assistants and apprentices and lived the life of a successful artist in a rich court, comfortable and respected and, it seems, genuinely happy, in the particular way that people who are doing what they are best suited to do are genuinely happy, not in a state of constant excitement or pleasure but in a state of deep and quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of a life that is pointed in the right direction. It was in Milan that Leonardo began to work seriously on some of the great painting projects that would make his name not just in his own time but in all the centuries that followed. He worked on a series of religious paintings for the court and for the churches of the city, including the painting that is now known as the Virgin of the Rocks, a mysterious and beautiful painting in which the figures of the Virgin and the infant Christ and the infant John the Baptist and an angel are arranged in a rocky landscape, half cave and half garden, lit by a soft and sourceless light that seems to come from within the picture rather than from any identifiable source. A light that is characteristic of Leonardo's mature work, a light that describes form not by illuminating it from outside but by seeming to reveal it from within, as if the forms themselves were softly luminous, as if the shadows and the highlights were aspects of a single continuous substance. The painting took years, as Leonardo's major works always did, because he was not content to solve only the formal problems of composition and color and light but was always going deeper, always asking what kind of light falls in a cave, what does the air look like in an enclosed rocky space, what is the geology of this kind of formation, how do the plants grow in this kind of light, how does water find its way through rock? And each of these questions opened onto further questions and further investigations and further drawings in the notebooks, and the painting grew richer and deeper as this process went on, accumulating the knowledge of a sustained and loving investigation until it became not just a beautiful picture but a world, a complete and internally consistent place that you could step into and believe in entirely. The notebooks in Milan grew even more wide-ranging than they had been in Florence. Leonardo was working simultaneously on hydraulics and the design of canals and waterways for the Lombard Plain, on the theory and practice of painting, on the anatomy of horses for the great equestrian statue, on designs for new kinds of mills and pumps and machines for lifting and moving heavy things, on musical instruments and acoustic theory, on the geometry of arches and the stability of buildings, on the behavior of light through glass and water, on the classification and description of plants, and on a project that he would return to again and again throughout his life, the design of a flying machine, a device that could lift a man into the air and allow him to move through it as birds moved, freely and at will. The notebooks themselves were small enough to carry, small enough to fit in the leather pouch that hung from his belt as he walked through the city or along the canal banks outside the city walls, and this portability was essential to how he used them, for the observations that filled their pages were made on the spot, in the moment, in the presence of the thing being observed, not reconstructed from memory later at a desk but captured immediately. The hand moving before the thought was fully formed, the drawing and the looking happening simultaneously in a single continuous act of attention. He would stop in the middle of the street to record the gesture of a man arguing with a vendor, would pull out the notebook at the edge of a canal to sketch the pattern of ripples made by a thrown stone, would open it in the stable to draw the particular way a horse held its weight on 3 legs while the 4th rested, and all these observations would be filed away in the small pages, to be returned to later or sometimes never returned to sit there as evidence of the world's inexhaustible supply of interesting things, things worth noticing, things worth the 30 seconds of a quick sketch and the brief note in mirror script. At night in his rooms in Milan, when the candles were lit and the city outside was growing quiet, Leonardo would sometimes go back through the notebooks he had filled in recent weeks, reading his own earlier observations with a kind of scholarly distance, as if they had been written by someone else, subjecting them to the same critical attention he gave to everything else, asking whether the observation was accurate and complete, whether the drawing captured the essential quality of the thing, or only its superficial appearance, whether the conclusion he had drawn was justified by the evidence or was an assumption that needed to be tested. This self-critical practice, this willingness to be a skeptical reader of his own work, was part of what made his observations so reliable and his conclusions so durable, the habit of holding even his own most cherished ideas at arm's length and asking whether they were actually true rather than merely plausible or convenient. The flying machine was perhaps the most characteristic of all Leonardo's projects because it combined, in a single aspiration, all the qualities of his mind: the close observation of nature, the systematic extraction of principles from observation, the translation of principle into mechanical form, and the deep desire not just to understand the world but to participate in it more fully, to break through whatever limits separated human possibility from the possibilities that nature had demonstrated were achievable. He spent years watching birds, not just watching them but studying them in the most careful and systematic way, making drawings of their wing structure and the arrangement of their feathers and the way they spread and flexed the wing in different phases of flight, measuring the relative proportions of wing to body and calculating the forces involved in lift and thrust, filling notebook pages with these observations and then beginning to translate them into mechanical designs, wing structures made of fabric and wood and leather, pivoting joints that would allow the pilot to change the angle of the wing, harnesses and controls and instruments for reading the direction of the wind. He never built a flying machine that worked. The problems were, we know now, much more difficult than he understood them to be, involving not just the mechanics of the wing but the power-to-weight ratio of any human-powered device, a ratio that no technology available to Leonardo could have solved. But the drawings he made in pursuit of this dream are among the most extraordinary documents in the history of science, not just for their technical ingenuity but for the quality of thought they reveal, the willingness to follow an idea wherever it leads, the confidence that the natural world is not a set of given facts to be accepted and catalogued but a set of principles to be understood and, once understood, to be extended and applied, the conviction that the human mind can, by the careful and patient use of its faculty of observation and reason, eventually understand everything. In the evenings in Milan, when the work of the day was done, Leonardo would sometimes walk to the edge of the city where the fields began and stand looking at the sky, watching the birds moving against the clouds, the swifts that circled high in the summer evenings and the pigeons that moved in fast, decisive flocks between the rooftops of the city and the open country beyond. He would stand very still and watch for a long time, the way he had stood as a child on the hillside above Vinci watching the stream, with that quality of total and unhurried attention that was his most fundamental characteristic, as if the world were a teacher and he its most willing and attentive student, as if no moment of looking was ever wasted or too long. The winters in Milan were considerably colder than the winters of Tuscany. The city sat in the middle of the great northern plain and received the full force of the winds that came down from the Alps and from the Swiss plateau, cold and persistent winds that found their way through every gap in the wool and leather of even the best winter clothing. Leonardo, who had grown up in the relatively mild climate of Tuscany, adapted to the Milan winters with the same equanimity he brought to everything, noting in his notebooks the particular quality of winter fog on the plain, the way the frost formed on the inside of windows and the patterns it made as it grew, the behavior of water in very cold temperatures, the way the light was different in winter, lower and paler and giving everything a kind of thin, precise clarity that was entirely different from the rich golden light of Tuscan summer afternoons. He lived in Milan for approximately 17 years, from around 1482 to 1499, with some interruptions and journeys back to Florence and to other places. These 17 years were among the most productive of his life, and they culminated in the work that is, for many people, the most famous painting in the Western tradition, The Last Supper, painted on the wall of the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie, a painting that Leonardo worked on for approximately 3 years in the mid-1490s. A painting that transformed the representation of this particular subject by treating it not as a static religious icon but as a human drama, a moment of psychological complexity and emotional truth, in which 13 individual men respond to a single devastating announcement in 13 individual ways, each response a revelation of character, each gesture an expression and posture caught in the moment of its most essential form. The preparation for the Last Supper was characteristic of Leonardo's working method. Before he placed any paint on the wall, he made hundreds of drawings, studying the hands and the faces and the postures of the individual figures, working out the compositional logic of how 13 people around a table could be arranged so that each was visible and legible and yet all were bound together in a single unified space. He walked the streets of Milan looking at faces, making mental notes and sometimes quick sketches of expressions and types, keeping a small notebook with him always in which he recorded observations that might be useful, the way a particular person's face changed when they were surprised or distressed or questioning, the way grief and shock registered differently in different faces, the way the body unconsciously followed the movement of emotion. He was not just an artist collecting references but a student of human nature, studying the language of the body with the same close attention he gave to the language of water and light. When the painting was finally done, or rather when Leonardo finally stopped working on it, for it is not clear that he ever considered it entirely finished, it was recognized immediately as something extraordinary, as a work that went beyond what painting had previously attempted or achieved, and Ludovico Sforza, who had commissioned it, was reported to have been moved to silence when he first stood before it. The figures in the painting were alive in a way that painted figures had not previously been alive, not performing their roles in a sacred narrative but experiencing them, feeling the weight of the moment, responding to it with the full complexity of human emotion, and the space in which they sat was rendered with a precision of perspective and a subtlety of light that made it seem not like a representation of a room but like a window into one, as if the wall had dissolved and been replaced by the thing itself. During these Milan years, Leonardo's circle of friends and colleagues was wide and varied, including mathematicians and musicians and architects and engineers and philosophers, men who shared his conviction that the world was a place worth understanding and that the mind was equal to the task. He had a particular friendship with the mathematician Luca Pacioli, with whom he collaborated on a book about proportion and geometry, providing the beautiful geometric drawings that illustrated the text, and through Pacioli he deepened his already considerable interest in mathematics, in the forms and relationships that lay beneath the visible surface of things, in the way number and geometry were not abstract inventions of the human mind but descriptions of the actual structure of the world, the architecture of reality itself. He also, during these years, took on several students and assistants in his workshop, young men who helped with the production of paintings and who lived in his household, and with several of these young men he seems to have formed genuine and warm relationships of affection and intellectual mentorship that were important to him in a life that, for all its richness of work and thought, was in some ways a solitary one. Leonardo never married, never had children of his own, and the question of his inner emotional life, of what he felt and desired and needed from the people around him, is one that we can only approach through fragments and indirect evidence. What we can say is that he was generous with those he was close to, that he inspired loyalty and affection in the people who knew him well, and that the warmth that is so palpable in his paintings, the tenderness with which he renders the human face, the gentleness of his Madonnas and the sympathy of his portraits, was not something he drew from nowhere but was an expression of a nature that was, beneath the formidable intellect and the vast curiosity, essentially and deeply kind. The last years of the 15th century brought a profound disruption to the life that Leonardo had built in Milan. The political situation in northern Italy, which had been relatively stable under Ludovico's rule, began to collapse as the French King Charles VIII and then his successor Louis XII pressed their claims to Milan and to the Duchy of Naples, and in 1499 the French armies entered Milan and Ludovico fled and the comfortable and productive world of the Sforza court dissolved almost overnight. Leonardo, who had been the court artist and engineer and who had organized his life around the patronage of the Sforza family, found himself suddenly without a patron, without an income, without the institutional support that had made the previous 17 years possible. He left Milan in the winter of 1499 with his household and his students, taking with him his notebooks and his painting materials and whatever else he could carry, and he traveled for a time before eventually returning, in the spring of 1500, to Florence, the city of his early training, the city where his reputation had first been established and where he was still remembered and honored, though he had been absent for so long that a whole generation of new artists had come up and established themselves, and the Florence he returned to was in some ways a different city from the Florence he had left. He was 48 years old when he came back to Florence, not old by any measure, but carrying 17 years of the most extraordinary intellectual and artistic work, 17 years of painting and engineering and scientific investigation and teaching and the constant daily practice of looking and drawing and thinking and writing. 17 years that had produced a body of notebooks that were already vast and that contained a representation of the working of a single human mind that had no precedent and would have, for a very long time, no successor. Florence received him with honor. The city's rulers and the leading families were aware of his reputation and were eager to have his work, and almost immediately there were commissions and projects and offers of employment. He began work on a painting that was described by those who saw it in its early stages as a cartoon, a full-scale preparatory drawing of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and the infant John the Baptist, a composition of extraordinary tenderness and compositional daring, in which the figures are arranged in a pyramidal group with a density and a warmth that seems to compress all of human family feeling into a single image. And when this cartoon was put on display in the church of Santissima Annunziata, the people of Florence came in such numbers, according to a contemporary account, that the display lasted for 2 days and the room was continually full, men and women and young and old, all moved by something in the image that went beyond what art had previously been able to do. It was also in Florence in these first years of the 16th century that Leonardo began or continued work on the painting that would become, over the centuries, the most recognized image in the history of art, the portrait of a young woman that we now know as the Mona Lisa. The circumstances of this painting's commission and the identity of its subject have been the subject of more scholarly debate than perhaps any other single work of art. But what is not in doubt is that it occupied Leonardo for a long time, that he worked on it over a period of years, that he carried it with him when he left Florence, and that he was still working on it, still adding and refining, in the last years of his life. The Mona Lisa is not a large painting. It is intimate in scale, designed to be looked at closely, to be held as close as you might hold a letter or a book, and this intimacy is part of its effect, the sense it creates of being in the presence of a particular person, of a specific human being at a specific moment, a woman who is neither posing in the formal sense nor unaware of being looked at but who seems to be engaged in a private thought that the presence of the painter, and by extension the presence of the viewer, has gently interrupted. She looks out of the painting with an expression that is famously difficult to describe, an expression that hovers between attention and amusement and something deeper and more private, an expression that changes as you look at it, that seems to shift when you look at the eyes directly and then at the mouth and then at the landscape behind her, as if Leonardo had understood that a living face is never one thing but always a field of possibilities, always in motion between states, and had found a way to paint not the fixed expression of a moment but the living potential of a face. The landscape behind her was painted with the same care and the same wonder as everything else in the picture, a landscape of water and rock and mist and distance that is not any particular landscape but a kind of essential landscape, a landscape seen as if from a great height or a great distance, the way the world looks when you are above it in imagination, when you can see the rivers running from the mountains to the sea and the rocks wearing down and the water filling the valleys and the whole long patient process of the earth reshaping itself over time, the geology that Leonardo had studied in the cliffs and the quarries and the river banks of Tuscany and Lombardy, the deep time that was written in the layers of stone and that he had read with the same patience and precision he brought to everything. In 1452, the year of Leonardo's birth in Tuscany, the pace of a human life was governed by the pace of the natural world, by the rhythms of light and dark, by the seasons of planting and harvest, by the distances that could be traveled on foot or on horseback in a day. And throughout his life, even as he imagined and designed things that would not exist for centuries, Leonardo remained deeply connected to these natural rhythms, deeply attentive to the world at the pace at which the world actually moved, at the pace of a river flowing or a cloud building or a bird making its slow circle in the evening sky. There came a time, around 1506 or 1507, when Leonardo left Florence again, drawn back to Milan by a French governor who was eager to have his services, and he spent several years in Milan under French patronage, working on paintings and on engineering projects and on the anatomical studies that were always ongoing, always producing new pages of extraordinary drawings that recorded the interior of the human body with a precision and a beauty that surpassed anything that had been done before or would be done again for many decades. These anatomical studies were conducted in the hospitals and dissecting rooms of the cities where he worked, in conditions that were cold and dark and unpleasant, working by candlelight on bodies that were in various states of preservation, working with tools designed for other purposes, cutting and recording and drawing with a focus so complete that all discomfort seemed to dissolve in the act of looking and understanding. The drawings that resulted from these dissections are, when you look at them, both beautiful and profound, images in which the functional and the aesthetic are so completely unified that it is impossible to separate them, in which the liver or the heart or the uterus or the vertebral column is rendered with a combination of scientific precision and formal elegance that feels like a kind of reverence, as if Leonardo were paying tribute to the intelligence of the design, acknowledging in the quality of the line and the composition of the image that the body was itself a work of art, a masterpiece of engineering that deserved to be represented with the full resources of the artist's skill. He wrote in his notebooks, in those right-to-left mirror lines, observations about the body that anticipated by centuries what later medicine would discover through different paths, observations about the structure of the heart and the movement of blood and the function of the liver and the mechanics of the joints, observations made not from the reading of authorities but from the direct examination of the thing itself, with no mediation between the eye and the object except the quality of the attention brought to bear on it. He also wrote, in these same notebooks, reflections on the nature of life and death that have a philosophical weight and a personal resonance that suggest he was thinking not just about the bodies he was examining but about the larger questions they raised, about what life was and where it came from and what it meant that these same bodies, so extraordinarily complex and functional, could simply stop, could become in a moment the cold and diminishing material that he worked within the dissecting room. The years in Milan under French patronage were productive but not entirely settled, as the political situation in northern Italy continued to be unstable, the French and various Italian powers contending for dominance in a series of wars and alliances and diplomatic reversals that made the life of any artist dependent on a prince or a governor uncertain from one year to the next. Leonardo moved between Milan and Florence and Rome and various other places, always carrying his notebooks, always looking, always drawing and writing, always maintaining the practice of observation and reflection that was the ground of his existence. He came to Rome around 1512 or 1513, drawn by the patronage of Giuliano de' Medici, the brother of the newly elected Pope Leo X, and he spent several years there in a comfortable position in the Vatican complex on the Belvedere Hill, with rooms and a workshop and the freedom to pursue his investigations. Rome was an extraordinary place to live and work, a city of ancient ruins and new building, of extraordinary art everywhere you looked, the ancient statues that were being dug out of the ground and the paintings that Michelangelo was finishing on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and the new St. Peter's that Bramante had designed and that was slowly rising in the middle of the old city. Leonardo was aware of all this, was part of the world in which it was happening, knew Michelangelo and Raphael and Bramante, the great artists of the Roman moment, and was respected by all of them even as he occupied a different position, older now, more philosophical, less concerned with the competition for commissions that drove the younger artists and more interested in the long investigations that only he was pursuing. The Rome years were not, by the standard of his earlier life, highly productive in terms of finished works. He was in his early 60s now, still vigorous in mind and still physically capable, but moving at a different pace, spending more time in reflection and writing than in the production of paintings, continuing the scientific investigations, making notes and drawings on topics that had interested him for decades and that he was still refining and extending. He was also beginning to feel, in Rome, a sense of being somewhat out of step with the world around him, of inhabiting a set of questions and a way of approaching them that was not quite what anyone around him was asking, and this sense of isolation, gentle as it seems to have been, was perhaps part of what made him receptive to the invitation that came in 1516 from the King of France. Francis I was a young king, 21 years old when he ascended the throne in 1515, a man of genuine aesthetic sensibility and wide intellectual curiosity who was in the process of transforming the French court into a center of Renaissance culture, importing Italian artists and scholars and craftsmen to the chateaux of the Loire Valley and creating an environment that combined military power with cultural aspiration. He had seen the Last Supper during the French occupation of Milan and had been deeply moved by it, and he was determined to have Leonardo at his court, not to produce specific works but simply to be there, to be present as a kind of living embodiment of the ideal of the universal man, the man who could do and think and create across the full range of human possibility. Leonardo accepted the invitation. He was 64 years old, and the prospect of finishing his life in a comfortable and honored position, free from the need to compete for commissions and the political complications that had always attended his Italian career, must have been genuinely attractive. He traveled to France in the late summer or early autumn of 1516, crossing the Alps perhaps for the last time, looking back from the high passes at the long landscape of Italy receding to the south, the familiar mountains and the familiar light, and then turning north toward the unknown green of France, the broad river valleys and the dense forests and the soft northern sky. Francis gave Leonardo the manor house of Clos-Luce, near the royal chateau of Amboise on the Loire River, a small and comfortable house of red brick and stone, with a garden and a vineyard and a small kitchen and adequate rooms for Leonardo and his household, which now consisted of his longtime assistant and companion Francesco Melzi, who was a young Milanese nobleman who had attached himself to Leonardo many years before and who would remain with him until the end, and his servant Battista de Villanis, and perhaps one or two others. The house was connected to the chateau by a tunnel or an underground passage, and Francis came frequently to visit Leonardo, came as a friend and a student, came to sit and talk in the comfortable rooms of Clos-Luce and to hear the old man talk about art and nature and the principles that governed the world. These conversations, which we know about only through later accounts and through what Leonardo wrote in his notebooks in these last years, must have been extraordinary. Two people from entirely different worlds, different generations, different languages, different ways of knowing, finding in their shared curiosity about the same things a ground of genuine meeting. Francis would ask Leonardo about the paintings he had brought with him, the Mona Lisa and the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and the Saint John the Baptist, the three great works that Leonardo had carried from Italy and that would remain in France after his death, eventually finding their way to the Louvre, and Leonardo would explain what he had been trying to do in them, would talk about the nature of light and the representation of depth and the way the human face could be painted so that it showed not just the outward form but the inward life. The Loire Valley in these last years was a beautiful place to end a life. The river was wide and slow and studded with sandbars and small islands, and in the early mornings it lay under a thin mist that the rising sun burned away gradually, revealing the water in long silver stretches, the willows along the banks, the distant towers of the chateau. The countryside around Amboise was green and gentle, nothing like the dramatic landscape of Tuscany or the flat immensity of the Lombard plain, but a landscape of a different kind of beauty, a landscape of meadows and orchards and slow rivers and deep shade, a landscape that was kind and unhurried and that seemed to ask nothing of the person who lived within it except that they be present, that they pay attention, that they allow the beauty of it to fill them quietly. In spring the Loire Valley bloomed in a way that was soft and profuse and unhurried, the apple and pear and cherry trees in the orchards around Close-Loose coming into flower in waves that spread from one tree to the next over the course of days, white and pale pink against the blue sky, and the fields filling with the particular intense green of new grass that has had a long and cold winter to prepare itself and now is making up for lost time with a cheerfulness and vigor that is entirely affecting, that makes you want to simply sit in it and be grateful. Leonardo, when he could walk, would go out into this spring landscape and move through it slowly, stopping often, resting on the low stone walls that bordered the orchards, watching the bees working the blossoms and the birds carrying nesting material in their beaks and the light moving through the branches in the small wind that always seemed to be moving in the Loire Valley. A gentle and persistent wind that came from the west and smelled of the Atlantic and brought with it a freshness and a softness that was different from the dry warmth of the Italian winds he had known all his life, but that was, in its own way, entirely beautiful. Summer in the Loire was a long and generous season, the light lasting well into the evening, the river warm enough in the shallower places for the village children to wade, the vineyards coming into leaf and beginning the slow process by which grapes formed and swelled and took on color over the long months of summer, and the evenings fragrant with the smell of cut hay and the sound of cattle moving in the fields and the distant bells of the churches in the villages along the river. Leonardo sat in the garden of Close-Loose in these summer evenings when the weather was warm enough, sitting in a chair that had been brought out from the house and set under the broad shade of a mulberry tree, and he would have his notebook on his knee and would write or draw, or sometimes simply sit and look, watching the swallows cutting their quick arcs in the sky above the garden, the same swallows or their descendants that cut those same arcs over the rooftops of Florence 40 years before. The same principles of flight and lift and the management of air that he had studied for decades, still there, still demonstrating themselves freely and with the same elegance, in the golden evening air of France. Leonardo walked in this landscape when his health allowed, which in the last years was less and less often, for he had suffered, sometime around 1517 or 1518, a partial paralysis of his right hand, a stroke or some similar event that affected his ability to use the hand he had always used for the most delicate drawing. He adapted, as he always adapted, moving more of his drawing to his left hand, dictating more of his observations to Melzi, spending more time in reflection and in the verbal formulation of ideas that he had previously worked out as much through the hand as through the mind. The notebooks continued to grow, though more slowly, filled with the final refinement of ideas that had occupied him for 50 years, the culmination of a lifetime of looking and thinking and wondering. In the evenings at Close-Loose, when the day was done and the light was fading and the fire was lit in the large hearth of the main room, Leonardo would sit in a chair near the fire and look into the flames the way he had looked at everything in his life, with that quality of total attention, watching the way the fire moved and changed and the way the light shifted on the walls and the ceiling, the way the shadows were never still but always moving in slow and complex patterns that were like the patterns of water and like the patterns of wind in grass and like all the other patterns that he had spent his life observing and recording and trying to understand. The fire was, in its way, everything: heat and light and movement and transformation, the same forces that moved through the whole world, the same principles he had traced in the veins of the leaf and the channels of the river and the currents of the air, all present here in this small room in France at the end of a life that had moved through the world with more curiosity and more attention than perhaps any life before or since. There were visitors to Close Loose in these last years, travelers who came to pay their respects to the old man, to see the famous works that hung in his rooms, to hear him speak if he was willing to speak, to carry away whatever impression they could of a person who had already become, even in his lifetime, a figure of legend. One of these visitors, a cardinal with his retinue, came in October of 1517 and spent time with Leonardo, and later his secretary wrote an account of the visit that has survived, describing Leonardo as an old man whose right hand was somewhat impaired but whose mind was still entirely clear and quick, who showed them the Mona Lisa and the Virgin and Saint Anne and the St. John and spoke about them with evident pleasure, and who also showed them many notebooks full of drawings and writings on anatomy and hydraulics and machines and optics and other subjects, more, the secretary wrote, than could be printed in many volumes. The winter of 1518 to 1519 was cold, as winters in the Loire Valley can be cold, with frost on the ground and the river running low and clear between its banks and the sky above the chateau pale and flat for days at a time. Leonardo spent most of this winter indoors, in the warm rooms of Close Loose, wrapped in the heavy wool robes that had become his habitual dress, working when he could, resting when he needed to, talking with Melzi and with the servants and with the king when Francis came, as he continued to do throughout these months, to sit by the fire and talk. In April of 1519, Leonardo made his will, leaving his vineyard in Milan to a servant and his books and notebooks and paintings and drawing instruments to Melzi, who had been as much a son as an assistant for more than a decade and who was understood by everyone who knew them to be the natural heir of Leonardo's intellectual and artistic legacy. The making of the will was a quiet and practical act, the act of a man who has looked clearly at where he is and what is coming and has organized what he can, who has set his affairs in order with the same methodical care he brought to every other task, the same steady attention to what is real and what is necessary. He died on the 2nd of May, 1519, in the house at Close Loose, with Melzi present, and according to one account with the king present as well, though this detail may belong more to legend than to fact. He was 67 years old, which was a good age for the time, and he had used those 67 years with a thoroughness and an intensity and a breadth of engagement that no other life in the record of human history quite matches, had filled those years with more seeing and more thinking and more creating than most lives contain even in outline. He was buried in the church of Saint Florentin at the chateau of Amboise, near the place where he had spent his last years, in the green and gentle country of the Loire. What he left behind was not just the paintings, though the paintings were enough, were more than enough, were among the most beautiful and searching images that human hands have ever made. What he left behind was also the notebooks, the 50 or 60 surviving volumes out of the perhaps 160 or more that he produced, the vast accumulation of drawings and observations and speculations and designs that together constitute something entirely unprecedented, a record of a mind engaging with the full breadth of the natural and human world. A mind that was curious about everything and capable of everything, and that brought to every question the same quality of patient, loving, total attention. The notebooks were scattered after his death, distributed by Melzi and his heirs to various collectors and libraries and private hands, and for many years many of them were lost or forgotten or misidentified. sitting in archives and libraries under other names, waiting to be recognized for what they were. They have been gathered back together over the centuries, laboriously, incompletely, and they are now in libraries and museums in Milan and Windsor and Paris and Turin and Madrid and Venice and other cities, and scholars are still working through them, still finding in their pages ideas and observations and drawings that have not been fully appreciated or understood. Still discovering in the mirror-written pages of a man who died 500 years ago insights that feel fresh and alive and immediately relevant to questions that are still being asked. There is something in Leonardo's life that is both inspiring and, if you stay with it long enough, deeply calming, a quality that comes from the consistency and the patience of his engagement with the world, from the sense you get, reading his notebooks or standing before his paintings, that here was a person who was never in a hurry to be somewhere other than where he was, who found in every present moment something worthy of the full exercise of his attention, who moved through the world as the world itself moves, slowly and thoroughly and with complete dedication to the process of understanding. He was born in the spring in Tuscany, in a farmhouse on a hillside, with the smell of new grass and the sound of birds in the olive trees, and he grew up watching the light change on the hills and the water move in the streams and the clouds build and dissolve over the valley, and this watching was the beginning of everything, the root from which all the rest grew, the first practice of the attention that would eventually produce the notebooks and the paintings and the engineering designs and the anatomical drawings and all the other things that make his life so remarkable. And in the end, in the last years at Close Loose, surrounded by the green and unhurried landscape of the Loire, he came back to something like that beginning, to the old man sitting by the fire watching the flames the way the child had watched the stream, with the same quality of absorbed and grateful attention, the same willingness to simply be present to whatever was there, to let the world come toward him and receive it fully, to ask nothing of it except that it continue to be itself, mysterious and beautiful and endlessly worthy of looking. The paintings he left behind are still there, still looking back at us from the walls of the great museums, still doing what he made them to do, which is to present the world as it is when it is seen with the fullest possible attention, when nothing is hurried and nothing is overlooked and every surface and every depth and every quality of light has been considered and rendered with the loving precision of a mind that could not settle for less than the whole truth of what it saw. The Mona Lisa looks out with her ambiguous and living expression, and the Virgin of the Rocks glows in its mysterious light, and the Last Supper still holds its 13 figures in their moment of human complexity and feeling, and the St. John the Baptist lifts one finger toward something above the frame, something we cannot see but can perhaps imagine if we look long enough and with sufficient quietness of mind. And in the notebooks, in the mirror-written pages, the studies continue, the water flowing around the stones, the bird spreading its wing, the light entering the eye, the heart beating in the open chest, the cloud forming over the mountain, the river finding its way to the sea, all of it noted and drawn and reflected upon, all of it held with the same patient and generous attention. All of it part of the same endless investigation that was his life's work and his life's joy, the investigation of a world that was, to the very last, more beautiful and more mysterious and more worthy of attention than any single lifetime could exhaust. Let the mind rest now in that landscape, in the gentle hills above Vinci where the mist lies in the valley in the early morning and the olive trees stand silver in the first light and the sound of bells drifts up from the village below, where a child is already looking, already paying the full and unhurried attention that will make of a whole life a single long act of seeing, where the world is still new and the questions are still open and the notebooks are not yet filled. And there is time. There is all the time there is, to look and look again at the beautiful and ordinary mystery of things, the way the light falls on a stone, the way the water moves around it, the way the shadow deepens as the sun moves and lightens again as it passes, the whole slow and patient conversation between light and matter that was always, for Leonardo, the most important conversation, the one worth listening to most carefully, the one that never came to an end. Breathe in slowly, and let the hills of Tuscany settle around you, the warm stone and the cool shade and the smell of earth and grass and the distant sound of water. Let the day be long and unhurried. Let the light move across the valley at its own pace, which is the pace of the earth turning, slow and steady and entirely without urgency. Let the questions be many and the answers few and the looking be enough, the patient faithful looking that was Leonardo's great gift and his great practice, the thing he did every day of his life from the hillside above Vinci to the house at Close Loose, from the first morning to the last, always looking, always finding, always grateful for the inexhaustible generosity of the world. And as the light fades now, as the evening comes in gently over the hills and the first stars appear in the pale sky above the valley, and the fire in the hearth of the farmhouse sends its warm light onto the stone walls, let the day close softly, let the work be laid aside and the notebooks closed, let the mind rest in the quiet between one thought and the next, in the soft darkness where everything is still and the breath moves in and out without effort, and the world continues its patient and beautiful revolution, and sleep comes as gently as the mist comes in the morning, filling the valley slowly, softly, without hurry, without sound. And let the mind move now, at its own slow pace, through the rooms and the landscapes that have been gathered here, through the farmhouse on the hillside and the workshop on the street in Florence and the great refectory wall in Milan and the small house at Close Loose with its garden and its mulberry tree. Let it move through the smell of linseed oil and stone and new grass and wood smoke and the cold air of the dissecting room and the warm air of the Loire Valley in summer. Let it move through all the light that Leonardo saw and painted and wrote about, the even morning light from the north-facing windows, the golden afternoon light on the Tuscan hills, the pale winter light on the Lombard plain, the soft filtered light of a rocky cave, the light from a fire at night, the light in a woman's eyes in an unfinished painting, all of it the same light, all of it the same force moving through the world and revealing the world to itself. All of it worthy of the attention that a single human life can give it. Let the notebooks close now, gently, the pages settling against each other with the soft sound of paper finding its rest, the mirror writing becoming still, the drawings of wings and rivers and hearts and faces resting in the dark between the covers. Let the hand that held the chalk and the pen be still, the extraordinarily gifted hand that moved across so many thousands of surfaces in so many decades and left on each of them something of the quality of the mind that directed it, the quality of patient and loving attention, the quality of genuine wonder at the world. Let that hand rest now, the fingers loosening, the tension of the grip dissolving, the hand lying open in the way that hands lie open in sleep, soft and receiving rather than active and reaching, ready to begin again when morning comes. The river flows in the dark outside the window of Close Loose, the wide slow Loire, carrying its water from the mountains to the sea in the way that rivers have always carried water and will always carry water, indifferent to the names of the people who have lived beside them and observed them, going on in the simple faithful performance of their nature, which was one of the things Leonardo loved most about rivers. Their complete and unself-conscious commitment to being what they were, their untroubled enactment of the principles that governed them. The river flows, and the night deepens, and the stars move overhead in their slow arcs, and somewhere in the house the sound of breathing, steady and quiet, the breath of sleep, the breath of a mind at rest after a day of full and faithful attention to the world. Let this breath be yours now. Let it deepen and slow. Let each breath carry you a little further into the quiet that waits beneath the activity of the day, the still and spacious quiet that is always there, that the business of waking life keeps at a distance but that sleep restores. That is the ground of everything, the silence in which all the sounds of the world become audible, the darkness from which all the light of the world becomes visible. Let the hills of Tuscany be close around you, the mist in the valley, the olive trees on the slope, the sound of a stream somewhere below, steady and soft and continuous, the sound of water finding its way through the world, which is the sound Leonardo listened to first and which he carried with him all his life and which is now, as you drift toward sleep, your sound too, the sound of the world at its most fundamental, most patient, most kind. Sleep now, as gently as the evening comes. Sleep as the mist fills the valley. Sleep with the notebooks full and the candles out and the fire dying down to coals in the hearth and the garden quiet outside and the river moving in the dark a little way away, carrying the world's water to the sea, doing what rivers do, faithful and unhurried and entirely sufficient. Sleep in the knowledge that the world is beautiful and that it is enough to look at it with full attention, that a life spent looking is a life well spent, that curiosity is its own reward and wonder is its own destination, that the light on the hills in the morning will be there tomorrow as it was there today, as patient and as generous and as willing to be seen as it has always been.